this rich guy, it's not so hard.
Well, it
but
depends on kind of rich guy. There's like the rich, snobby people, and then there's the rich, you know, give, like there's some like who like are willing to pay taxes like more, and there's those who just don't.
What if you get to hell someday and there's like all these rich guys, and then there's guys just named rich, you know?
You know what?
I didn't have a lot of wealth, but my name was rich, so, you know.
Well, that'd be unfortunate. That's,
Oh, they should have called themselves Rick.
They should have
Have
called
you seen that
themselves
one
Ricky,
you
thing
know,
on the
there aren't
internet
really
that says, you
many.
know,
Ricardo, or something like that.
I haven't ever heard of a pastor called Rich.
Ivan's a Russian
so,
name. We're not talking about that. We're talking
Gotcha.
about Rich.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Ivan?
Should we talk about chapter 3?
Okay.
We were
And then
just
we'll-
jumping on trade, like starting to touch on it. There, right?
Okay. You want to talk about trade a little bit? Or, I was going to follow the chapters, but I really don't care. I mean, I was going to follow them.
No, follow the jumpers.
There's that spooky portrait of Peter Stuyvesant. Okay. There's a source of fodder for some of these AP questions is these differences between New England and particularly the Chesapeake or the South in general. You also get this difference between the middle colonies and the New England colonies and the southern colonies. So that's important to kind of keep that in your head. Chesapeake region, some things to keep in mind. In the 17th century, they almost immediately, because of the diseases and it's much warmer, more malarial, and there are more mosquitoes and whatnot, their lifespans are still, as the European settlers start to colonize Virginia and Maryland, their lifespan shrinks. And there's statistics in the book, you know, half the people don't make it to age 20. I mean, you know, the infant mortality and the child mortality must have been horrific. Lots of single men. People are not emigrating here in family units, which is what you get in New England. There are single men looking to make their fortune. So, and that's never something that provides for a whole lot of social stability. I mean, single men, you know, young single men can be a very, very disruptive force in society. They, you know, they're not tied down. They're not worried about their house and their family and their children. They can be kind of nutty and do crazy things if they're not embedded in sort of a social network. So that you get a lot of single men running around. Family structure is weak. A lot of out of wedlock births. It said something like a third of the women that were married were pregnant when they were married. Obviously, tobacco is the big crop.
And where was it was it Maryland they used rice, or they used rice somewhere?
Further south,
Yeah.
Carolina, South
Okay.
Carolina, Georgia, you know, rice. And I think it's tied to climate. Tobacco grew very well in the Chesapeake region, so that was the big cash crop. Now, their labor needs. There's almost no natural, the population there is not increasing naturally because the death rate is so high. I mean, you know, again, they come over from England where their life expectancy is in the mid-40s, 50, something like that, and it drops into the 30s. I mean, I remember reading this in college about how these guys come over and they live for 12 years and they die. Some fever in their mid-30s. In New England, you're going to see the opposite. Their life expectancy stretches out to almost 70, which
Because that's
is
the
really
thing,
not
because
much,
isn't the
not much different from today's life expectancy.
because the conditions are far better than in Europe because there's not as much filth and waste.
You're right. They're on small farms. They're not piled together in cities where diseases brew and spread. So how do they deal with these labor needs? Because tobacco is becoming very popular in Europe. It's a cash crop. Where are you going to get the labor? Well, not through natural increase because children are dying. I mean, people are dying. The Indians don't make very good labor source. They don't sit down very well under a whole lot of discipline. They just leave. I mean, again, it's just, we should go into the woods, screw this, Africans, now, we're still talking about the 17th century. Where's my pen?
I keep my pen in my pocket. Just saying, it'd be easier. I just thought it'd be easier to keep the pen in a pocket.
A pen?
Oh,
Like
there
a
it is.
pencil.
Africans at that point, black slaves were very expensive, and it wasn't something that they were interested in. It wasn't the cheapest source of labor. Instead, they go for indentured servants. These are mostly from England, young men from England, some women. An indenture is a form of contract, it's a document, usually for 7 years. Again, in England at this point in time, there's a surplus of labor. There's a lot of landless, jobless, people milling around England, and so the market sort of takes its course. So there's a labor surplus in England. There's a labor shortage in North America and the Chesapeake region. So young men agree to work for 7 years. In return, they're given transportation in North America, and then some of the contracts they got certain things after they did their 7 years. They got whatever, a barrel of seed or something like that. Remember the head rate system?
A bit.
That's where, like, the person who took on an indentured servant got, like, 50 more acres.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I think the state government sponsored this, or the colonial government sponsored the state government's listen to me. It's money. So if I'm a landowner and I'm trying to bring labor over, and I bring you two guys over as indentured servants, I demonstrate that to the authorities, then I'm awarded 100 acres. I don't have to share that with you guys, but you'll help me, obviously, work it. So for every labor import, it was 50 acres. I don't know if that had to be necessarily indentured servant. Let's just see what that says. Wow, it says these white slaves, these indentured servants, represented more than 3/4 of all European immigrants to Virginia and Maryland in the 17th century. So that's quite a lot. I mean, that's where the bulk of the population came from. Head rate system. Come on, head rate. Come on, where?
It might be in my key terms somewhere. I could probably Google it.
No, anyway.
Okay.
All right, Bacon's Rebellion. What you kids think it has something to do with breakfast. Bacon's Rebellion. It's in 1676. Now, I don't think years are all that important, although it does put it in perspective. It's fully 100 years before the American Revolution. We talked about some of the social conditions in these tidewater, these Chesapeake colonies. Lots of young men, lots of single men. By 1676, you've got a lot of guys that are released from their indenture. They are trying to acquire land. They have social aspirations. They want to move up in the world and get their own farms and so forth. And they seem to be blocked frequently by the wealthy elites that sort of control the colony. They end up moving closer to the frontier to get land. When they're out there on the frontier, they run into the Indians. They have trouble with the Indians. And there's violence between the Indians and some of these settlers. Well, turns out some of these Indian tribes have commercial relationships with the wealthy landowners further back east, the wealthier white planters. And those wealthier white planters, they don't really want to take drastic action against the Indians because, they're doing business with them. all this comes to a head with the Bacon's Rebellion, and it is a major event in American history, because it really, one of the main results is the Virginia and Maryland in particular, they're going to move away from indentured servants into African slavery, and you see African slavery really takes off in the years after Bacon's Rebellion. It doesn't last long. Bacon dies. He's his 29-year-old planner, and he gets a fever and dies, and it sort of breaks up, dissolves. The governor, William Berkeley, hangs everyone he gets his hands on. There's a great quote in there from King Charles II back in England, who said, who's back on the throne. You know, this is after his father had been executed. He said, you know, this crazy governor in Virginia executed more rebels than we did for the murder of my father, Charles I. I mean, you know, we hung 4 or 5 guys. This guy's hanging everyone and gets his hands on there. So he calls him some crazy fellow. Anyway, the Royal African Company. When I was doing some practice questions, it was in the text, but I hadn't remembered it. The Royal African Company was one of these government monopolies, one of these companies chartered by giving the blessing of the English government. It's English then. And it has the monopoly in carrying slaves to the New World, to the English possessions, 1672 to 1698. So that last quarter of a century, the end of that period of time, then the monopoly expires in 1698, and then anyone can get involved in the carrying trade of slaves, the slave trade. And
Wait, when did they stop doing it?
1698, so close to 1700. And the Rhode Islanders are big into it. Rhode Island is a Newport and Providence, mainly Newport, I think, were major ports, and so a lot of shipping there, and they get involved in the slave trade. By 1750, you see the results of this, the demographics. Half of Virginia, by 1750, are African slaves. 2/3 of South Carolina are African slaves. Now, there had been blacks brought to the New World as early as 1619, which is 12 years after Jamestown's fall. There's 1619 they go to Virginia. But their legal status at that moment was nebulous. May not have been all that different from white indentured servants from here. With this many blacks, and you know, again, a couple things going on here. One, well, what's one of the things going on here? Why are we going to treat Africans different from?
We believe they're subhuman.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a racist factor here. No doubt about it. And also, they're speaking a different language in some instances. Their customs and habits they're very different. And people back then would deal with difference. So you start to get slave codes. The slave codes are laws that are passed by the colonial legislatures, and they build up a legal basis for slavery. They determine how you purchase and sell slaves. They define what a slave is. Slavery is going to be defined by race. There's no instance of, in all the hundreds of years of slavery in North America, of white people being enslaved. It just didn't do that. And you can call an indentured servant. You can say, well, indentured servitude was like white slavery. Yeah, for 7 years. That's different from saying you're going to be a slave your whole life because you know you're going to die that way. Plus, your children are going to be slaves too. And your children's children and their children are going to be slaves.
How is it that the Spanish then could use the Indians as slaves, but the Americans weren't as easily able
The
to?
Spanish, what the Spanish found, I think, was that 70-80% of the Indian population would die off because they just didn't have enough, and there weren't enough to suit their labor needs, so they went to Spain and began exporting. The textbook breaks down. There's a good chart there. Only 5% of the Africans transported, over 7 million Africans transported from North Africa, West Africa to the New World. Only 5% were transported to the South North America. And if you get down to, I mean, you know, Brazil, Mexico, Cuba, all these countries have African citizens of African ancestry to this day. They're non-indigenous. They were forcibly brought over. Slave codes. The textbook talks about the Gullah language of South Carolina blacks. This language, a mixture of English and some of the native African languages of West Africa. And Gullah is a corruption of Angola, which is it's a country in Africa. It's a region. Slavery widens the social structure in the South. You've got these larger plantations, these great plantations, these families that own a lot of wealth, and great planters. And then you've got these smaller farmers, and they're not nearly as wealthy. They can't afford as many slaves, although there are certainly people that own a smaller number of slaves. And you've got landless and folks that are laborers or tradespeople. South doesn't have a lot of cities. The roads are very bad, or not just non-existent. Not perversely, the horrific mortality rates in the South and in the Chesapeake region in particular end up benefiting women because we're going to talk about how in New England women are having 8-10 children, and childbirth was one of the most dangerous things before modern medicine. That was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. And so, you're going to do this 8 times in my life, I mean, talk to your mom, once or twice was a lot. And so down south, women aren't having that many children. And a lot of times the men are dying. So you've got, and under the inheritance laws, women could inherit their husband's estate. So if Mr. and Mrs. Jones, own 200 acres, and Mr. Jones, poor fellow, dies age 33. Here's his widow, Mrs. Jones, age 30. You don't think of a widow being 30 years of age, but there were a lot of young women who had a lot of economic power wandering around Virginia. Not wandering around, but located in Virginia. George Washington, and we're skipping ahead 100 years here, but George Washington married a widow. Martha Dandridge Custis was a young widow. I mean, she was in her mid-20s and she was a widow already. And she, through her husband's estate, she was one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. George, knew what he was about. I mean, he saw it as a good opportunity.
Stereotype about Southern widows or something that spawns from all this. Like, there's a lot of Southern widows, and if you just go down South America widow, that's the easiest get rich quick scheme there.
I guess you got to make yourself appealing to a Southern widow then. How do you do that? I don't know.
Go down south in the general league, I suppose.
And so women, I mean, and I remember reading articles about this in college about how women really did have a certain amount of economic power down in, and just power in general. I mean, they're alive and their husband's gone, and they control 120 acres and 40 slaves, and That's Mrs. Jones. She's a 25-year-old widow. She's an important person here in the community. You need to, you know. All right, let's talk New England. Longer life, healthier environment. Life expectancy, like I said, moves up to almost 70 years, which really isn't much different from life expectancy today. Off of that, you know, I kind of figure out. Very focused on families. Most of the people that come over and settle in New England are already in families. They come over as families, not as single men looking to earn their fortune. And they're coming over for different reasons. They're coming over to escape religious persecution, create this shining city on a hill, and live godly lives. Very strong families. Women had some legal protections. They couldn't vote, and the textbook talks about the difference. They didn't have this. You didn't have the mortality, so you didn't have widows like you had in the South. But you know, women again could expect to bear 8 to 10 children, one child every few years on average, which is hard. And yet there were some protections. The divorce was exceedingly rare, abandonment exceedingly rare, and that did protect women to a certain extent economically. And I should point out, let's go back to Virginia for a second. Okay, for every woman who's married to a wealthy landowner who dies, there's a woman who's married to an indentured servant or someone that's got a very small farm, and she becomes a widow. And you know, her lot's not that great because she doesn't have all these resources, you know, and she's on her own at that point in a society that doesn't really, you know, value. Now she can, because women are in such short supply, she could probably marry again pretty easily. But you know, today we know that one of the quickest ways for women to descend into poverty is to have children to a man and the man abandons her. And you know, that didn't go on. I mean, they just, that didn't happen. Divorce was exceedingly rare. Everything was built to protect the family and marriage. Adultery is strongly discouraged. You guys are reading Scarlet Letter right now by Nathaniel Hawthorne, New England author, and this story is you know, the punishment of an adulterer that's central to that story. New England is a tightly knit society as opposed to the South. You know, the other thing about the South is it's just more spread out. There's more of it, and so people are more isolated. They're out there on these big farms or plantations. They're not as geographically connected as they're going to be in New England. New England the settlement patterns tend to be in small villages, small farms. They have a unity of purpose. They are bound together by their Puritan beliefs, many of them. There's a relatively high adult literacy rate. Education seems to be more important in New England. You know, Massachusetts Bay is founded in 1630. And 6 years later, they found a college, Harvard College. They call it just the college now. Whereas Virginia's, you know, you go almost 90 years before they found college. The college of Mary, I think, is 1693. So 1607 to 1690, what is that? 86 years. In New England, towns over 50 had to have some form of public schooling for the children. Today, obviously, school board, you know, Mrs. Converse and all the school board there. But they didn't have it like that. But Puritan churches were democratically run. You know, again, the congregational structure. I mean, the congregation met. And they hired preachers, and they decided on the contract for the preacher, and they decided, or I should call the preacher the minister, they decided where to build the church and who would get in the church. I mean, it was very democratic. As opposed to the South, which is various religions, but the Anglican religion is hierarchical, and there are bishops and there are priests appointed by the bishops, and congregations have really no say in it. Roman Catholic Church is like that. And in New England, growing out of this, the New England town meeting is going to develop, which Thomas Jefferson referred to as the great school for democracy, or a great school for democracy. All right. Slavery we talked about. Right. Okay, let's talk about the halfway covenant and the Salem witch trial. Let's just talk about the Congregational Church. They are Calvinists. They're influenced by the Swiss theologian John Calvin. And they believe in a pretty stark theology that you need to work hard, you need to live a godly life, you can't engage in luxury, and only God knows whether you're going to be saved or not, and most of us aren't going to be saved, most of us are going to be damned, and that's just the way it is. Just suck it up and deal with it. It's term I want to know too is a Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is a new form of sermon began to be heard from Puritan pulpits. The Jeremiah, taking their cue from the doom-saying Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, earnest preachers scolded parishioners for their waning piety. So, the preachers would basically be telling these people that they were in big trouble. You guys are going to hell in a handbasket. And that term is used to, if someone really reads you the riot act, if your mom is, you're not going to match anything, and that's a Jeremiah. You're being scolded. Now, what was the halfway covenant? Remember this? Why do I have to do all the talking? God.
I feel like I know it, but I can't do it.
Admitting your.
Oh yeah,
Something about her.
yeah. It was you say you become like a Christian, and like they'll kind of let them into the church, but you won't really be like a full church member.
That's what like John Edwards is doing.
The idea then was you had to be be fully converted and have a conversion experience and convince the members of the congregation that you were worthy before you would be admitted to the covenant of that church, before you would, you're a covenanter at this church. Well, problem was, the standards were pretty high. And you couldn't just be like, yeah, I had one of those conversion experiences and I'm really into God and everything, so can I be in the church? No, you really had to convince them that this had happened. The halfway covenant, they're basically saying, all right, we're going to allow members of we're going to allow the children of existing members in. Not on a full basis, on a halfway basis. We're going to let them be members, but they're not full members because they haven't had this religious conversion experience yet. So if old Niklaus is a fully covenanted member, but he really wants his children to be in his church with him, and they haven't really had this, well, we're going to let him in. but they're only halfway members, and that's what the halfway covenant means. And so, what's it mean for the Puritan Church in general?
They become less strict, more or
Yeah,
less.
they're diluting, they're kind of watering themselves down. They're letting in people, they're letting in my ne'er-do-well kids who aren't really true believers.
Is it just kids?
Well, I think it's
Well, I think it was like an attempt to bring more to the church. So I don't know if it was strictly children, but I know they were a large part of it.
I think that I'm not saying that it didn't apply to non-children, but I mean that's the impetus for doing this, because people, want their children in the church. Let's talk about New England a little bit. What's the land like in New England? Most of these people are farmers. What's the land like? Is it really rich and bountiful?
It's rocky.
Really rocky. If you've ever seen the Maine coast, this is not a farmer's dream. So these people have got to be thrifty. They've got to take care of their resources, and that's and we see that the New England personality, kind of flinty, reserved. I don't know if I've told this story, but my wife. My best friend from high school, he also married, we both married New England women. And so he and his wife were driving out on Cape Cod in the winter, and they were looking for possible houses to rent for like a beach house in the summer. Right? So there was a house that they thought they might be interested in. And as they drove by it, this is in the winter, so no one's out there, but the owner happened to be there. There was a guy clearly doing some work in the house. There was a car parked there. And my friend John said, well, let's stop and we can go see the house. Well, his wife was like, she was having a panic attack. No, you can't do it. No, he's not expecting us. And John he didn't understand what the big deal was. She's a New Englander. You don't stop by someone's house unannounced like that. You don't. That's too familiar. That's too. Do you know what I mean? They're a little bit. They don't do that. When we first got married, shortly after we got married, we cut down some trees in our backyard on the alley. We have an alley back of our house, so the trees are on the alley, and I live in town, so the houses aren't widely separated. They're pretty close to each other. So there's this pile. The guys chopped up. They cut up these trees, and there's basically this big mound of logs back there in my backyard on the alley. So the evening after this occurred, after dinner, 3 of the old timers that live on the alley, they come down. A couple of them have their coffee cups from dinner. They come down the alley to see what's going on, and they're out there talking. They're pointing over, And my wife was like, "What are they doing? What did they?" This is a change in the neighborhood. We had 12 trees here, and this guy cut them down today, and the neighborhood looks different. And they're coming down and talking about it. And she just thought, that would never happen anymore.
That's because they don't have as many trees.
You mind your own business. You don't. Do you know what I mean? You don't get into other people's business like that. Now we look at that and say, these guys they were some of the best guys in the world. Earl and Bud. They're just being friendly, just being neighborly. That's how we interpret it. Now, by the same token, if you get out further south, they think they view us as we view New Englanders. They think we're cold and we're not real friendly, and Southern hospitality is a lot more. A couple of main industries up in New England. The fishing becomes really important, and they're going to sell a lot of fish back to England and also down to some of the other the spice colonies, the spice islands in the Indies. So fishing becomes huge. slavery never really takes over. I mean, economically, it's not, they don't have these cash crops that require large plantations. So slavery is not economically viable. And now, are there slaves? Yeah. My understanding is John Hancock, obviously the president of the Continental Congress and the signer of the Declaration of Independence, Hancock owned slaves. He had house slaves. And there, there was slavery in the New England colonies up until the American Revolution, not the Civil War, the American Revolution. But it was not, you did not have, the South had something that's referred to as a slave society, where the society is built around slave labor. I mean, that's what's driving South Carolina. That's what's driving their slave codes, their social distinctions, their generation of wealth. I mean, if you've got a lot of slaves and a lot of land, you're going to be wealthy. If you don't, you're probably not going to. So that's an important distinction. So you have slavery in the middle colonies and in New England, but they don't have slave societies. It's largely a society of small farmers, tradespeople, fishermen. Timber is another big industry, another big export. Nautical stores, pitch. And there's this talk about the impact of the New England mind and the New England conscience and that Puritan inheritance on the nation as a whole. And many of the abolitionists were New Englanders. And again, even if you look, and a lot of these New Englanders then, as the soil, we talked about the soil wasn't great, and as it gets even worse because the soil doesn't get any worse, but as the Midwest opens up and there's really good soil there, and it's easier to produce all these crops really cheaply, the profits they're making on these New England farms are considerable. So a lot of these people emigrate and they go west. They go to places like the Western Reserve of Ohio, and that becomes a big anti-slavery area, for example. The burned over district in New York, which is also anti-slavery, and Stephen A. Douglas was New England born and moved out. So there's this whole migration of New Englanders through the sort of the middle and upper half of the country. U.S. Grant's family was from Massachusetts. Let's see. All right. Let's talk about the middle colonies. Let's just talk about the ethnic breakdown of the colonies. Let's say you get into the years before the American Revolution. We're talking about the 13 colonies. The English are going to be the predominant group, about half, about 50% of the ethnically 50% in 1790 are English. Now that's not. I would have thought it was more than that. Now, if you want to add in Scottish, Scots-Irish, and Irish, then that's going to take it to 65%, about 2/3. So the British Isles, let's say, accounts for about 2/3 of folks here. Just be careful because the Scots-Irish and the English, they're very different people. They're Protestant, but the Scots-Irish are, religiously they're different. They tend to be the evangelicals. They're going to tend to be Baptists. They're going to tend to live in the backcountry. They're lawless as hell. They're whiskey drinking. They're not. Well, the English look down their nose at them. I mean, the English, sort of think the Scots-Irish are wild. That's why the English sent them over to to try to subdue Ireland. I mean, they thought the Irish were freaking nuts too, so they thought, we send our wildmen from Scotland over to Ireland, maybe, you know, get our enemies to fight each other. I mean, that might be good. Africans are going to be about 20% of the population. Now, again, in New England and middle colonies, they're going to be a much smaller percentage. You get into the South, they're going to be significant minorities. In some cases, majorities. Germans, 7%. War in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania and North Carolina for some reason. Pennsylvania and North Carolina had significant German populations. I don't know the story. I mean, obviously the story, you know, why the Germans in Pennsylvania? Well, William Penn marketed it to them. I mean, he goes to basically the Pennsylvania, we call it Pennsylvania, the Amish. He ran ads and had billboards, handbills placed in some areas of Germany where there were these German pietists who were similar in their religious beliefs to English Quakers. And he got a lot of them to emigrate here. So I don't care if you worship in a way that, you know, is that? Basically, he's trying to say to them, you can worship any way you want here, I don't care. It's not just as long as you pay taxes to me, proprietor, and buy my land. We're cool. I'm good with that. I think Penn's a very interesting man. He has this vision of a modern, pluralistic society where, you know, he really doesn't care about religion. We're all, you know, we got this little social contract here. We're all going to do our own thing, and he doesn't even care that they're not English speakers. I mean, that's significant. As long as you obey the law, pay taxes, be a good citizen.
And then his son's statement.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, his sons aren't his. Now, the Dutch, that's the other important group. The Dutch obviously had settled New York, which had been New Amsterdam. They had come from the Netherlands, obviously. They spoke Dutch. And they ultimately captured by the English in the 70s, 80s, 60s.
What percent did you say the Dutch were?
Well, they're only 3%, but New York, in the New York colony, they're going to be more. Now, let's just be clear about one thing. Who were the Scots-Irish again? They're all right. England, Wales is over here somewhere, right? Okay, so this is the British Isles, and England is the dominant kingdom here, and England very early on dominates very early. Before the settling in North America, the English have dominated these islands. At one point, and the Scottish Highlanders were wild men. I mean, you know, there's a reason why the Romans built a wall across the island there, because the Scots were just lunatics. So when the English take over, they try to sort of incorporate the Scots. They decide to send some of the Scots over here to try to help subdue the Irish, who were also very difficult people to control. And so the Scots who live over here, and they live in certain areas, they become, you know, they take their ways with them. They intermarry somewhat. They're not Irish Catholic. They're not, you know, sort of the same ethnic stock, or they don't believe in the Roman Catholic Church. So they're these Scottish Protestants. They've lived here for a long time. They're in the minority. They're very clannish. This experience of being in a majority Catholic country with the Catholic peasants that can't stand them, this makes them even more sort of willful and strong-minded and so forth. So they're not Scotch, and they're not Scottish. They're not Irish. They're Scots-Irish. And you know, many of them leave Ireland and emigrate to the US. And there are a ton of famous Americans that have Scots-Irish ancestry. Andrew Jackson, you know, again, was this very, very warlike, look at me funny, we're gonna fight a duel kind of guy. Anytime you see someone with a name, an MC name, MacArthur, Douglas, the General in World War II, Douglas MacArthur, George McClellan from the Civil War. A lot of those people were Scots-Irish. Now some are Irish, but a lot that we have here are William McKinley. The president preceded Roosevelt, he's not Irish American, he's Scots-Irish, he's Protestant. And that's the other thing, they're Protestant. They never adopt the Catholicism of Ireland. All right, Scots-Irish. Now, talk about the social structure a little bit. There's no titles of nobility over here. I mean, and again, if you are a duke or an earl or some major landowner in Europe, which you know is very civilized and has all sorts of goods and services and things that you're not going to get in this wild new world, why would you emigrate to America? I mean, there'd really be no point in that, right? Unless you really wanted a challenge, I guess. So we don't have dukes and earls and nobility over here. There are some very wealthy landowners. There are some very, very rich people. They tend to dominate the colonial governments. I think the textbook says something like, the people that sat in the House of Burgesses in colonial Virginia owned something like 70% of the land in colonial Virginia. Well, that's a lot. This is not a...
Well, wasn't it set up by the Virginia Company? Virginia wasn't set up by the Virginia Company?
Wasn't what set?
Virginia, the colony, the Virginia Company. So would they have been possibly from that and they bought all the land anyways then?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think... Not sure. I'm just not sure.
Okay.
I think, I mean, might they have been shareholders or... I don't know. I mean, some of the shareholders have never left the company. They don't... Their plan is not to emigrate. They're going to send, you know, poor landless whites and indentured servants and whatnot over there. They're staying in England. You've got in the middle colonies, which are sort of a mixture between they're sort of halfway between the colonial, the New England colonies and the southern colonies. The farms aren't as big as in the South, but they tend to be bigger than you have in New England. The land's better. There's some excellent farmland in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, upstate New York. Some slavery, but not, again, it's not, you know, Pennsylvania is not a slave society, nor is New Jersey. You got a lot of landless laborers. Some of the important positions outside of agriculture were ministers, clerics. So people who were ministers either in New England or in any region were widely respected. It was John Adams' father's fondest wish that his son become a congregational minister. And his father was disappointed when John told him that he really didn't want to do that. And that's really, and there's a real tie into the Puritanism, because the Puritans founded these colleges in New England, like Harvard and Yale, because they wanted a place to train their ministers. They were going to learn biblical languages, Greek and Latin, and that was very important to them. Physicians were widely respected. And as the colonies grew, and you've got these disputes arising over land titles and boundary disputes and wills and all, my God, all the people dying young and the challenges of the states over states and state disputes. You need lawyers, and so lawyers become important. Yeah, John Adams, it says here, John Adams was a law student. His father to be was Abigail. She was Abigail Smith. I forget her father's first name, but he was a minister, and he thought that Abigail was kind of marrying down because John was a lawyer. Agriculture really important. 90% of the people involved in that. Tobacco is the staple crop of Maryland and Virginia. There was wheat cultivation in the Chesapeake. Wheat was the big crop in the middle colonies, Pennsylvania. And some of that sent to, again, there's this, we get into the triangle trade. The British colonies in the West Indies, the sugar colonies, so lucrative with sugar that it didn't make economic sense for the sugarcane planters down there to really devote any of their land to growing foodstuffs for their slaves. It just made more sense to grow on every inch they possibly could for sugarcane, and then just import wheat and corn or flour from the mainland of North America, or rice, and that's what they did. So we even colonies, and this is what's meant by even colonies that were not slave societies, they are implicated in the slave trade insofar as the New Englanders are involved in carrying slaves, which is that's pretty heinous. But they're also they're selling food to their masters so they can be fed.
Is that kind of like the whole thing of when you buy a printer, it's cheaper to buy a new printer than get new ink? It's cheaper to buy a new slave than feed the old ones or something like that?
Yeah, we've got, it's 3:30. I started late because I was running around the building here. Should we? See you, Dole. Wasn't it great? Wasn't it fun? Who's going to bring cookies next week? I think D will.
As long as they're glucose free, sure. Yeah, I'll see.
Yeah, that's no fun. We'll dip them in honey.
Like, you'll be these will be my first, homemade cookies, so yeah. Exactly, that'll be great.
Never mind.
You like
It's
paste?
called getting just O's or Oreos.
I got
or something
Progressive's
like that.
propaganda
We're not
snacks.
talking.
Got lots of those at my house.
I think I have some leftover Cheez-Its from a
Shall
couple
we,
months ago.
oh, C6 is the French name. We didn't even get to that. What do you want to do? Do you want to put up some practice questions or not?
We can do practice questions.
My throat started to get sick of talking, and my suspicion is some of you are probably getting sick of listening to me. Listen to my voice all day. Do you guys know The Hunt for Red October yet? If you watched it, if you let it shape your life.
What is it?
I haven't watched many of those macho movies, but that's one I've
It's
watched.
not so much a macho movie, it's an intellectual.
Parts of it.
You would just watch that.
There's a scene where the Russian. Did you see Good Will Hunting? You know the guy who's like the really smart MIT professor who's trying to work with Good Will Hunting? He's got a foreign accent. He plays this Russian captain. Yeah, he gets these orders. He was waiting for one thing to happen. It didn't happen. He gets orders. These hours are 7 bloody hours. No, wait, these orders are 7 bloody hours old. It's all lights a cigarette. It's cool. It's cool. These orders are 7 bloody hours old. Sitting on the bottom like an idle schoolboy. Rocket. Doesn't Rocket sound like this? You kids, Crockett, knock that off.
Or that's the dog's name, and you're saying Crockett knocked that off. It depends where you put the comma. It's all punctuation.
Crockett, I'm not going to that.
The only reason anyone names their dog Croc is because it does sound like a curse word.
That's-
Your shit's a Croc.
That could be the generic name for a brand of Crocs.
It doesn't sound so much like a swear word as like something someone would say to try to keep from saying a swear word.
Yeah.
Just a random ejaculation.
Easy.
Crush it.
Now, we could do 1690 to 1754. That's going to be pre-French and Indian. What we could do next week is we could I think